Hey guys, tonight we pull back the curtain on a different kind of history, true crime. We're not venturing into the world of serial killers or audacious heists, but into the heart of a family home on what should have been the happiest night of the year. This is a story that begins with a fire, but the flames are not the end of the mystery. They are only the beginning. It's a case that asks a question so fundamental and so heartbreaking. It has haunted a family and a community for generations. What if the children weren't in the fire at all? This is a story from the tail end of World War II, a time of profound change and lingering tensions. It's an age when the American dream felt both within reach and incredibly fragile. And the monster in this story is not a face or a name, but a possibility. The possibility that 5 children didn't die a tragic accident, but were stolen away in the dead of night, their lives erased and rewritten by an unknown hand. So before you settle in, think about the certainty of home, the feeling of your family being safe under one roof. Now imagine that certainty turning to smoke and ash, leaving behind a question mark that burns for a lifetime. This story is a slow, agonizing search for an answer that may never come. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to delve into a mystery where hope itself becomes a form of torment. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a little comforting to know we're all here, together, pondering these impossible questions. Now dim the lights, let the world quiet down. Tonight, we're gathering around a hearth of memory, a fire that never went out. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The disappearance of the Sodder children. Our story begins in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small town nestled in the coal-rich Appalachian Mountains. The year is 1945. The world is breathing a collective sigh of relief as the war comes to an end, and a sense of weary optimism is settling over the nation. It is Christmas Eve, and in the large, 2-story timber house of the Sodder family, the familiar, happy chaos of holiday preparations is underway. The Sodder family was a prominent and lively fixture in the local community. The parents, George and Jenny Sodder, were Italian immigrants who had built a successful life for themselves in America from the ground up. George, who had emigrated as a boy, owned a thriving trucking business that hauled coal from the local mines. He was known throughout the county as a hard-working, opinionated, and fiercely principled man. He was particularly outspoken in his criticism of Benito Mussolini and the Italian fascist regime, a bold and sometimes contentious stance to take within the close-knit Italian-American community of the era. Jenny was a devoted mother, the quiet and steady anchor of a bustling household filled with 10 children. Their life was a testament to the American dream. But beneath the surface of their prosperity, there were whispers of tension. George's vocal anti-fascist views had made him some enemies, and his business success had likely bred some professional jealousy. These were small things, the normal frictions of life in a small town, but they would later be re-examined through the lens of tragedy. On that Christmas Eve of 1945, 9 of the Sodder children were at home. The 2 oldest sons were away serving in the military. The oldest daughter at home, 17-year-old Marion, had just come home from her job at the local dime store, bearing gifts for her younger siblings. The house was filled with the excited energy of children on the brink of Christmas morning. The older children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Irene, 8, and Betty, 5, asked their mother if they could stay up late to play with their new toys. Jenny agreed, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She gave them permission to stay up, with the simple instruction that the older boys remember to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before they went to bed. She then took the 2 youngest children, Joan and Sylvia, upstairs with her and went to sleep, along with her husband George. The night descended into a strange and unsettling quiet. Around 1 a.m. on Christmas morning, the phone rang, a shrill and jarring sound in the sleeping house. Jenny went downstairs to answer it. A woman's voice she didn't recognize was on the line, asking for a name she didn't know. In the background, Jenny could hear laughter and the clinking of glasses, as if from a party. She told the woman she had the wrong number and hung up. As she turned to go back to bed, she noticed that the downstairs lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. Assuming the children, in their excitement, had forgotten, she turned off the lights, locked the door, and went back upstairs. About 30 minutes later, she was awakened again by a loud, strange thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, like something heavy had been dropped and was sliding down the shingles. She listened for a moment, but the house fell silent again, and she drifted back to sleep. At approximately 2:30 a.m., she woke up for a third time. This time it was to the acrid smell of smoke. George Sodder's office, located on the ground floor, was on fire. The house was burning. A frantic, primordial panic took hold. Jenny screamed, waking George. They grabbed their youngest daughter, Sylvia, who was sleeping in their room, and scrambled out of the house. Their older children, who were sleeping on the main floor, Marion, John, and George Jr., also managed to escape the rapidly spreading flames. They all stood together outside in the freezing night, their bare feet sinking into the snow, and watched in absolute horror as their home was consumed by a raging inferno. And then, the most sickening realization of all washed over them. 5 of their children were still inside. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Irene, and Betty were all trapped in their bedrooms in the attic. What followed was a desperate, chaotic, and ultimately futile series of attempts to save them. George Sodder, in a frenzy, smashed a window to try to get back inside, cutting his arm badly in the process, but the smoke and heat were an impenetrable wall. He ran to the side of the house to get his heavy-duty ladder, the one he always kept propped there, a ladder that was more than long enough to reach the attic windows, but it was gone. It was not just moved, it had vanished. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled desperation, he tried to drive one of his large coal trucks up to the side of the house, planning to climb on top of it to reach the windows, but the truck wouldn't start. He tried his second truck. 2 was dead. Both vehicles had been in perfect working order just the day before. The family stood helplessly in the snow, screaming the children's names into the roaring fire, praying for a response, a sign of life from the attic windows. They heard nothing but the sound of their home being destroyed. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but the phone line was dead. Another neighbor tried to make a call from a tavern in town, but for some reason, they couldn't get through to the operator. The fire department in Fayetteville was just 2.5 miles away, but it was a small, all-volunteer force, and Chief F.J. Morris couldn't drive the fire truck because he didn't know how to operate it. By the time a driver was found and the department finally arrived at the scene, it was nearly dawn. The Sodder house had already collapsed, leaving only a smoldering, ash-filled crater where their home and their lives had once stood. It was Christmas morning, and 5 of the Sodder children were gone. In the cold, gray light of that Christmas day, as the embers of their home still glowed, the Sodder family was plunged into an abyss of shock and grief. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, offered the official and, at the time, logical explanation. He told George and Jenny that the fire had been so intensely hot that it would have completely cremated the children's bodies, leaving nothing behind but ash. It was a terrible, but in the chaos of the moment, a believable explanation. The family, numb with loss, began the grim process of accepting that their children had perished in the fire. Death certificates were issued, citing the cause of death as fire or suffocation. But as the initial shock began to recede, it was replaced by a creeping, gnawing doubt. Jenny Sodder, a practical homemaker, could not reconcile the official story with her own common sense. She knew how long it took for things to burn. She had roasted countless chickens and hams in her oven. The idea that the bones of 5 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, could have been completely destroyed in a house fire that had lasted only 45 minutes before the structure collapsed seemed impossible to her. She began to conduct her own quiet, heartbreaking experiments, burning small animal bones in a hot stove to see if they would turn to ash. They never did. They were charred and brittle, but they always remained. George, too, began to obsess over the strange series of events that had preceded the fire. The mysterious phone call from the woman with the laughing voice, the loud thud on the roof, the missing ladder, which was later found tossed into a high embankment over 75 feet from the house. The two trucks that had mysteriously failed to start. And what about the fire itself? George was adamant that the fire was not caused by faulty wiring, as the fire chief had suggested. He had done the wiring in the house himself and had it recently inspected. The family's doubts coalesced into a deep and unwavering suspicion. They began to believe that the fire was not an accident, but a deliberate act of arson, a cover for something even more sinister, the abduction of their 5 children. This terrifying theory was bolstered by a series of strange encounters that had occurred in the months leading up to the fire. A traveling insurance salesman had visited the Sodder home and, after being aggressively rebuffed by George, had become angry. He had warned George that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. Citing George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini as the reason, another stranger had been seen lurking near the property, watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. The Sodders began to piece together a horrifying narrative. They believed that someone had intentionally set the fire, perhaps by throwing an incendiary device, a pineapple bomb, or some other type of fire starter, onto the roof, which would explain the loud thud Jenny had heard. They believed that while the fire created a diversion, the children had been kidnapped from the house, perhaps lured out by someone they knew, or taken while they slept. But who would commit such a monstrous act? And why? George's mind kept returning to his outspoken political beliefs. Could this be the work of the local mafia, as he called it, a retaliation for his anti-Mussolini sentiments? It seemed like something out of a gangster movie, but in the absence of any other explanation, it was a theory that took root and grew. Determined to find the truth, George and Jenny Sodder began their own investigation, a search that would become their life's work. They hired private investigators. They offered substantial rewards for information, and they started to push the authorities relentlessly to reopen the case. They pointed out the stunning inconsistencies in the fire chief's report and the overall incompetence of the initial investigation. A telephone repairman later confirmed to the Sodders that the phone lines to their house and to their neighbors had not been burned through in the fire. They had been cut high up on the pole, as if someone had deliberately severed their connection to the outside world before the fire was even set. The Sodders pleaded with Fire Chief Morris to conduct a more thorough, professional search of the basement rubble for any sign of human remains. Morris refused, sticking to his original story that the bodies had been completely cremated. Frustrated and desperate, George Sodder took matters into his own hands. He brought a bulldozer to the site of his former home and began to excavate the ash-filled cellar himself, sifting through the dirt and debris with his bare hands, searching for any clue, any bone fragment, any small piece of evidence that could prove his children had died in the fire. During his painstaking excavation, he made a few small, puzzling discoveries. He found some household appliances, their metal parts melted and twisted by the heat. He found a few coins, but he found no skeletons, no skulls, no human bones of any kind. This, to George and Jenny Sodder, was the final, irrefutable proof. Their children were not in that basement. They were not dead. They had been stolen, and they were out there somewhere. The search had just begun. The empty, ash-filled cellar became the foundation of the Sodder family's lifelong crusade. For George and Jenny, the absence of bones was not a mystery. It was a fact. It transformed their grief into a relentless, all-consuming mission. They were no longer just mourning parents. They were investigators, advocates, and the sole keepers of a truth they believed the world had conspired to ignore. In 1949, for years after the fire, George and Jenny decided to erect a monument to their quest. Along Route 16, a major thoroughfare that passed by the site of their former home, they put up a large, unmissable billboard. It featured the smiling, black and white portraits of their 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, and Betty. Beneath their faces, a simple, heartbreaking text outlined the details of their disappearance on Christmas Eve, 1945, and offered a substantial reward for any information that might lead to their return. That billboard became a local landmark, a permanent and haunting fixture in the Appalachian landscape. For decades, it stood as a silent testament to a family's undying hope and a community's enduring mystery. It was a daily reminder to everyone who drove that road that 5 children were still missing, and that their parents would never, ever stop looking for them. The Sodders poured their life savings into the search. They hired a private investigator from Washington, D.C., a man named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley was a former police officer, and he approached the case with a new vigor. He quickly uncovered a series of strange and disturbing details about the official investigation that only deepened the family's suspicions. Tinsley discovered the bizarre story involving the local fire chief, F.J. Morris. It turned out that Morris had, at one point, claimed to have found a human heart in the ashes of the Sodder home during a later limited search. He had sealed it in a metal box and presented it to a local minister, suggesting it be used as evidence to convince the Sodders their children were dead. However, when George Sodder insisted on having the heart examined by a professional, he took it to the funeral director in town. The funeral director determined that it was not a human heart at all, but a beef liver, and that it had never been exposed to fire. This deception was a stunning betrayal. Why would the fire chief plant false evidence? Was it a bizarre, misguided attempt to bring the grieving family a sense of closure? Or was it something more sinister? A deliberate act to stop them from asking more questions, to cover up a truth he didn't want revealed? For George Sodder, the answer was clear. He believed Morris was part of a larger conspiracy to conceal the kidnapping. The Sodders' investigation continued to turn up a stream of tantalizing, if unverifiable, leads. They traveled across the country, following up on dozens of reported sightings. A woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she had seen the children in the back of a car on the morning after the fire, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction. She said the group seemed tense and that they were heading west. Another tip came from a woman at a hotel in Charleston, who said she saw 4 of the 5 children a week after the fire. She recalled that they seemed out of place, accompanied by adults who refused to let them speak to anyone. These stories were impossible to prove, fragments of memory filtered through time. But for George and Jenny, they were glimmers of light in the darkness, fuel for their relentless search. Each potential sighting reaffirmed their belief that the children were alive. The search took its most dramatic and heart-wrenching turn in 1968, 23 years after the fire. One day, a letter arrived at the Sodder home. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph. The photograph was of a young man in his late 20s. He bore a striking and undeniable resemblance to their son Louis, who would have been around that age. He had the same dark, curly hair, the same dark eyes, the same distinctive upward tilt of his nose. On the back of the photograph, a cryptic, handwritten message was scrawled. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. The family was electrified. For Jenny, it was irrefutable proof. This was her son, Louis, alive. The message was a bizarre puzzle. Frankie could have referred to one of Louis's brothers. The meaning of ill boys and the string of numbers remained a complete mystery. Once again, the Sodders poured their resources into this new lead. They hired another private investigator and sent him to Central City, Kentucky, to find the young man in the photograph or the person who had sent the letter. But the trail went nowhere. The investigator found no trace of the man and, in a strange echo of the case's other disappearances, he eventually vanished himself, never contacting the Sodders again. The family tried to publicize the photo, plastering it in newspapers and magazines, hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize the man. No one ever came forward. The photograph became the final, great enigma of the Sodder case. Was it a cruel and elaborate hoax, designed to torment a family that had already suffered so much? Or was it a genuine, if cryptic, message from a long-lost son, a man who had been raised under a new identity and was making a desperate, coded attempt to reach out to the family he barely remembered? The authenticity of the photo has been debated for decades. Some experts believe it could have been doctored, while others see a genuine and powerful family resemblance. Whatever its origin, the photograph became another permanent fixture in the Sodder family's long and sorrowful saga, a tangible piece of a puzzle that refused to be solved. George Sodder died in 1969, just a year after the mysterious photograph arrived. He went to his grave still believing, with absolute certainty, that his 5 children had been kidnapped and were still alive somewhere in the world. After his death, Jenny continued the search alone. She wore black for the rest of her life, a permanent, visible symbol of her mourning for her lost children. She maintained the billboard on Route 16, updating it, repainting it, ensuring that the faces of her children would never be forgotten by the world that passed by. She fenced off the property where their home once stood and tended to it like a memorial garden, a sacred space dedicated to a life that had been stolen from her. Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989. After her death, the remaining Sodder children, now adults with families of their own, made the difficult decision to finally take down the billboard. After more than 40 years of public vigil, the family's search was over. But the private one, the one carried in the hearts of the surviving siblings and their descendants, never truly ended. Today, the story of the Sodder children's disappearance remains one of America's great, haunting, and unsolved mysteries. The case is a labyrinth of strange clues, dead ends, and tantalizing possibilities, where every theory seems both plausible and impossible at the same time. The official explanation, that the children perished in the fire and their bodies were completely cremated, is the simplest one, but it is riddled with holes. The complete absence of any human remains, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, the stalled trucks, and the bizarre deception of the fire chief. All of these things make a simple accidental fire seem highly improbable. The kidnapping theory, the one the family clung to for their entire lives, is a far more complex and dramatic narrative. It suggests a powerful and organized enemy, one capable of orchestrating a flawless abduction and maintaining a perfect code of silence for decades. The motive in this scenario is often tied to George Sodder's public condemnation of Mussolini. Perhaps a local faction of the mafia or some other organized crime element decided to make an example of him. Kidnapping his children would have been the ultimate punishment. This theory explains the arson and the strange events of that night, but it strains credulity. How could such a complex, large-scale abduction be carried out so perfectly, with no one ever breaking their silence? And to what end? The Sodder children's case is a profound and enduring American tragedy. It is a story that lives in the space between what is possible and what is believable. It is a testament to the incredible resilience of a family's hope in the face of unimaginable loss. For George and Jenny Sodder, to accept that their children were dead was to accept a world without answers. A world where a fire could simply erase 5 lives without a trace. It was easier and perhaps more human to believe in a grand conspiracy, in a lifetime of searching, than to live with the terrible, silent void of the unknown. The case has been passed down through generations, a piece of Appalachian folklore that is all too real, but it is a story that has no ending. What happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, and Betty Sodder? Did they die on Christmas morning in 1945? Their remains scattered to the wind by a fire hot enough to erase bone? Or did they live on, raised under new names, in new places, forever separated from the family that never, ever stopped looking for them, perhaps catching a glimpse of their own childhood faces on a lonely billboard on a West Virginia highway? We will likely never know. The witnesses are gone. The evidence has faded. All that remains is the story, a haunting American epic of loss, suspicion, and a love so powerful it refused to accept the finality of a fire. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the most painful mysteries are not the ones that end with a horrifying discovery, but the ones that never end at all, leaving only an empty space, a faded photograph, and a question that echoes unanswered through the years. You are absolutely correct. My sincere apologies for that repeated error. It seems my tracking of used cases failed. I appreciate your patience and will ensure this does not happen again. I will now provide a completely new and unused story, following all your specified formatting. Thank you for flagging that. The Cleveland Torso murders Cleveland, Ohio, in the mid-1930s. The city, once a proud and booming hub of American industry, a powerhouse of steel and manufacturing, was on its knees. The Great Depression had crippled its economy, shuttering factories and leaving thousands of men out of work. In the industrial flats of the city, a desolate gully known as Kingsbury Run became a magnet for the dispossessed. It was a scar on the landscape, a dry riverbed flanked by railroad tracks, scrapyards, and the crumbling brick husks of abandoned warehouses. Here, in this grim corridor of poverty, a sprawling shantytown had sprung up, a makeshift city of tar paper shacks inhabited by transients, rail riders, and families who had lost everything. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a world away from the gleaming towers of downtown Cleveland, and it was here that a new and uniquely terrifying kind of evil began to surface. On September 23, 1935, two teenage boys playing on a slope overlooking the Run, an area known as Jackass Hill, stumbled upon a sight of unimaginable horror. Hidden in the tall weeds was the naked, dismembered body of a white male. His head and genitals had been removed. His body had been drained of blood, and his skin had a strange, reddish, leathery texture, as if it had been treated with a chemical. This was not the work of a common criminal. The dismemberment was clean, precise, surgical. It was the work of a butcher. The press, with its love for sensational names, quickly dubbed the unknown killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. This was not the first time such a gruesome discovery had been made. A year earlier, in September 1934, the lower half of a woman's torso had washed up on the shore of Lake Erie. She was dubbed the Lady of the Lake, and her case remained a strange, isolated curiosity. But now, with the discovery of two more bodies in Kingsbury Run, the first headless man was soon followed by another. Investigators began to realize that a serial killer was at work, a predator with a horrifying and consistent signature. Over the next 3 years, from 1935 to 1938, a reign of terror gripped Cleveland. A series of dismembered bodies, both male and female, began to appear with chilling regularity. The victims were almost always from the lowest rungs of society: the transients, the prostitutes, the forgotten souls who populated the shantytowns and hobo jungles of Kingsbury Run. They were people with no families to report them missing, no network of friends to ask after them. They were, for a killer who wanted to operate with impunity, the perfect victims. The killer's methods were terrifyingly consistent. The victims were almost always decapitated, often with such precision that the coroner believed it was the cause of death itself. The bodies were then expertly dismembered, the limbs severed cleanly at the joints. The killer had a clear and practiced knowledge of human anatomy, suggesting the skills of a butcher, a hunter, or a medical professional. The torsos were often left in plain sight, a defiant and gruesome calling card, while the heads and limbs were rarely found, making identification of the victims nearly impossible. This was not just murder. It was an act of complete and total erasure. The city of Cleveland, already struggling with the weight of the Depression, was now gripped by a primal fear. The newspapers fueled the panic with lurid headlines and terrifying illustrations. The public was convinced that a real-life ghoul, a human butcher, was stalking their streets. The police department was overwhelmed, and the pressure to solve the case and restore a sense of safety fell squarely on the shoulders of one man: Eliot Ness. Ness was, at the time, a national hero, a living legend. As the leader of the Untouchables, he had famously brought down the powerful Chicago mob boss Al Capone. In 1935, he had been hired as Cleveland's public safety director, a reformer tasked with cleaning up a corrupt and inefficient police force. He was the symbol of modern, scientific law enforcement, a man who believed in order, evidence, and incorruptible justice. The public had faith that if anyone could catch the Mad Butcher, it was Eliot Ness. But the Cleveland torso murderer was a different kind of adversary. He was not a gangster with a clear motive and a criminal organization. He was a phantom, a lone predator motivated by a private pathology that was beyond comprehension. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no ransom notes. He was a ghost, and Eliot Ness, the man who had faced down the mob, was about to confront the most frustrating and haunting failure of his celebrated career. The hunt for the torso murderer became the largest and most intense investigation in Cleveland's history. Ness assembled a special task force of his best detectives. They interviewed thousands of people, In an unprecedented move, they fingerprinted nearly every man living in or passing through the city's hobo jungles. Undercover officers, disguised as vagrants, were sent to live in the shantytowns, hoping to overhear a name or a confession. The investigation was massive, but it was also a product of its time. Forensic science was in its infancy. DNA was unknown. The police were working with little more than shoe leather and intuition, and the killer seemed to be one step ahead of them at every turn. A profile of the killer began to emerge. He was believed to be a white male, physically powerful enough to overpower his victims and transport their dismembered bodies. He was intelligent, organized, and methodical. He was also likely a man who could live a double life, a seemingly normal member of the community who harbored a monstrous secret. He was not one of the down-and-out residents of Kingsbury Run. He was a predator who hunted there. The investigation took a dramatic and controversial turn on the night of August 18, 1938. By this point, at least a dozen victims had been attributed to the killer, and the city was at a breaking point. Ness, frustrated by the lack of progress and facing immense political pressure, made a desperate and fateful decision. He ordered a full-scale raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytowns. Under the cover of darkness, dozens of police officers, led by Ness himself, descended on the sprawling camps. They rousted hundreds of homeless men and women from their sleep. And then, in a move that would forever stain his reputation, Ness ordered the shantytowns to be burned to the ground. The makeshift homes, built of scrap and desperation, went up in flames, casting a hellish glow over the industrial flats. Ness's rationale was that he was destroying the killer's hunting ground and flushing him out from his hiding place. But the action was seen by many as a brutal and misguided act of persecution against the city's most vulnerable citizens. He had destroyed the homes of the very people the killer was preying upon, and in doing so had likely driven away any potential witnesses. The fires of Kingsbury Run were a sign of a great lawman's desperation, an act that yielded no clues, only more misery. Amidst this public failure, however, a primary suspect was quietly emerging in Ness's private investigation. He was a man who seemed to fit the profile almost perfectly, a man whose name has become inextricably linked to the Torso murders, even though he was never charged. His name was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Sweeney was a brilliant but deeply troubled physician. He was a large, imposing man with a history of alcoholism and severe mental instability. During World War I, he had served in a medical unit that performed field amputations, giving him the precise anatomical knowledge needed for the dismemberments. And, most significantly, he came from a prominent Cleveland family and lived in a house that directly overlooked the desolate expanse of Kingsbury Run. Eliot Ness became obsessed with Sweeney. He had him brought in for a series of intense, off-the-books interrogations in a downtown hotel room. Sweeney was arrogant, intelligent, and seemed to delight in toying with the famous lawman. He never confessed, but he also never fully denied his involvement, playing a cat-and-mouse game with his interrogators. He failed 2 early polygraph tests, but the results were inadmissible in court. Ness was convinced he had his man, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction. All he had was a strong circumstantial case and a powerful gut feeling. Frustrated, he had no choice but to let Sweeney go. But the pressure of the investigation seemed to have a profound effect on the doctor. Shortly after the last official Torso murder in 1938, Dr. Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital. He would spend the rest of his life in and out of mental institutions. The murders stopped. The case was never officially solved, but for Eliot Ness, the mystery was over. He believed, until the day he died, that Dr. Sweeney was the Mad Butcher. But without a confession or a conviction, the case remained a frustrating and haunting open wound. The Phantom had been given a face, but he had never been brought to justice. The city of Cleveland was left with a terrifying question. Was the killer locked away in a mental hospital, or was he still out there, somewhere, waiting to strike again? The institutionalization of Dr. Francis Sweeney in 1938 marked the end of the official string of Torso murders. As suddenly and as mysteriously as the reign of terror had begun, it stopped. For the city of Cleveland, A fearful, exhausted calm settled over the industrial flats. The headlines faded, and the public, desperate to move on, tried to forget the ghoulish phantom who had haunted their city. But for Elliot Ness, the case was a wound that would never heal. He was left with the profound frustration of knowing, in his gut, who the killer was, but being powerless to prove it in a court of law. Ness's private obsession with Sweeney continued for years. From inside the various mental institutions and veterans' homes where he would spend the rest of his life, Sweeney seemed to delight in tormenting the famous lawman. He would periodically send Ness taunting, cryptic postcards, filled with rambling prose and veiled threats. The postcards were often signed with strange pseudonyms and seemed designed to keep Ness off balance. A final, psychological act in their long and unresolved cat-and-mouse game. It was the last, defiant gesture of a man who knew he had won. The case of the Cleveland torso murders became the great failure of Elliot Ness's otherwise storied career. The man who had taken down the untouchable Al Capone was ultimately defeated by a ghost. The failure haunted him, contributing to his slow decline from the pinnacle of American law enforcement. He left his position in Cleveland in 1942. His reputation as an infallible crime fighter forever tarnished by the one case he couldn't close. In the decades that followed, the torso murders became a dark and enduring piece of American folklore, a subject of endless fascination for historians, authors, and amateur criminologists. While Dr. Sweeney has always remained the primary and most compelling suspect, other theories have emerged, each one attempting to make sense of the brutal and baffling crimes. One theory suggests that the killer was not a single individual, but a series of copycat murderers, inspired by the initial Lady of the Lake case. This would explain some of the minor inconsistencies between the various crime scenes. However, the remarkable consistency in the signature of the crimes, the decapitation, the precise dismemberment, the draining of the blood, makes it far more likely that the murders were the work of a single, highly organized individual. Another theory points away from a medically trained professional and towards a common laborer with specific skills. Perhaps the killer was a butcher, a slaughterhouse worker, or a railroad man, someone whose daily work involved the dismemberment of animals or the rough and tumble life of the industrial yards. This would give them the physical strength and the practical, if not surgical, knowledge required. This theory grounds the killer more firmly in the world of Kingsbury Run itself, suggesting he was not just a predator who hunted there, but a part of that forgotten world. But every theory ultimately circles back to the same frustrating point: a complete and total lack of hard evidence. The killer was a forensic phantom. They left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, no witnesses. They operated with a level of care and precision that was almost supernatural. This has led some to believe that the killer must have had some form of law enforcement or medical knowledge that allowed them to so effectively erase their tracks. The victims themselves remain a tragic and largely anonymous footnote to the killer's legend. Of the 12 official victims, only 2 were ever positively identified. The others were simply John and Jane Does. Their heads never recovered, their life stories lost to time. They were the ultimate victims, people who were so marginalized in life that their very identities could be erased in death. Their anonymity was the killer's greatest tool, allowing him to operate for years without the kind of public pressure that arises when prominent citizens go missing. The legacy of the Cleveland torso murders is a profound and somber one. It is a story that speaks to a specific time and place, a city on its knees during the Great Depression, a world of deep social divides where the forgotten and the vulnerable were easy prey. The shantytowns of Kingsbury Run, which Elliot Ness so controversially burned to the ground, were both the killer's hunting ground and a symbol of the societal collapse that allowed such a predator to thrive. The case also stands as a stark reminder of the limits of even the most celebrated law enforcement figures. Elliot Ness, with all his resources, his fame, and his determination, was ultimately powerless against a killer who left no trail. It is a humbling story about the nature of evil, a demonstration that sometimes the monster is not a part of a grand conspiracy that can be dismantled, but a lone, dark mind that cannot be penetrated. In the modern era, there have been attempts to definitively solve the case using new technologies. Researchers have called for DNA testing on the old case files and the postcards sent by Sweeney, but the evidence is old, degraded, and has been handled by too many people over the years. A definitive DNA link is a near impossibility. The most compelling recent work on the case has come from historians and authors who have delved deep into the archives. Some have uncovered further circumstantial evidence linking Sweeney to the crimes, including a potential connection to one of the identified victims. Others have proposed new suspects, building intricate cases based on old police reports and forgotten witness statements. But without a confession or a new piece of physical evidence, the case remains officially unsolved. Dr. Francis Sweeney died in a veterans hospital in Dayton, Ohio, in 1964. He was never charged with the murders. The truth, if he knew it, died with him. Today, Kingsbury Run is no longer a desolate gully. It has been transformed by urban development, crisscrossed by highways and flanked by modern industrial parks. The shantytowns are gone, the ghosts of the Depression paved over, but the shadow of the Mad Butcher still lingers over the city of Cleveland. The story is told and retold, a chilling piece of local history, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of a great city. We are left with a mystery that is as cold and as hard as the steel that was once forged on the banks of the Cuyahoga River. It is a story without an ending, a book with its final chapter ripped out. Who was the Cleveland torso murderer? Was he the brilliant, tormented doctor who played games with Elliot Ness? Was he a common laborer with a dark secret? Or was he someone else entirely? A name that was never even considered, a man who lived and died in anonymity, his monstrous secret known only to himself? The case of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run is a perfect, horrifying void. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who are caught and unmasked, but the ones who get away, the ones who fade back into the crowd, leaving behind only a trail of butchered bodies and a question mark that will hang forever over a city's history. The killer was never brought to justice, but the fear he created and the legend he became have granted him a dark and enduring form of immortality. You are absolutely right. My apologies for the repeated error. I understand now, the block of 5 stories is meant to be a single, continuous script, so only the very first story should have the main introduction. All subsequent stories should begin directly, without any intro, to ensure they flow together as one piece. The disappearance of Judge Joseph Forscrater in the summer of 1930. New York City was a place of dizzying contrasts. The stock market had crashed the previous year, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. But the city's powerful and corrupt political machine, Tammany Hall, was still running at full steam. Backroom deals, bribery, and scandal were the order of the day. It was a city of secrets, a place where power and crime often walked hand in hand. In this world, Judge Joseph Forscrater was a rising star. At 41, he was a handsome, charismatic, and ambitious man. He had worked his way up from a working-class background to become a respected law professor at Fordham and NYU, and then, just 4 months earlier, in April of 1930, he had been appointed by Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt to a coveted position on the New York State Supreme Court. He was known for his sharp legal mind, his impeccable style, and his connections to the powerful figures of Tammany Hall. To the outside world, he was the very picture of success. But Judge Crater also had a secret life. He was a man who enjoyed the high life of the roaring 20s. He was a regular on the Broadway scene, had a fondness for showgirls, and was known to spend lavishly. He had a wife, Stella Crater, to whom he seemed devoted, but he also had at least one mistress, a showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz. He was a man living 2 lives, the respectable, upstanding judge by day, and the high-rolling man about town by night. In the summer of 1930, Judge Crater and his wife were on vacation at their summer home in Maine. In late July, he told his wife he needed to return to the city for a few days to straighten out those fellows. A cryptic remark that she took to mean he was dealing with some political matters. He promised to be back in Maine by her birthday on August 9th. On August 6th, Judge Crater spent the day in his chambers at the courthouse. He was reportedly in good spirits. He had his law clerk cash 2 large checks for him, totaling over $5,100, a massive sum in 1930, equivalent to over $90,000 today. He then took the cash, along with a portfolio full of documents, back to his apartment on Fifth Avenue. He spent some time there sorting through his papers. He told his maid he was going out for the evening and would be back later. That evening, he met two friends for dinner at a chop house called Billy Haas's Restaurant in the theater district. One of the friends was a lawyer named William Klein, and the other was a showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz, his mistress. The dinner was reportedly a pleasant one. They talked, they laughed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At around 9:15 p.m., Judge Crater stood up to leave. He told his friends he was going to see a comedy show on Broadway. He hailed a taxi on the street outside the restaurant. He smiled, waved goodbye to his friends, and stepped into the cab. And then he vanished. Judge Joseph Force Crater was never seen again. For 10 long days, no one even realized he was missing. His wife, Stella, was still in Maine, expecting him to return for her birthday. His colleagues at the courthouse assumed he was still on vacation. His maid at the Fifth Avenue apartment thought he was staying with friends. It was a perfect storm of miscommunication and assumption. It wasn't until he failed to appear for the opening of the court session on August 25th that his colleagues finally became alarmed. A quiet, behind-the-scenes search began. The police were not officially notified until September 3rd, nearly a month after he had disappeared. By then, the trail was ice-cold. The delay, born of a desire to avoid scandal and protect the reputation of a prominent judge, had given his abductors or his own disappearing act a massive head start. When the news of his disappearance finally broke, it became a national sensation. Crater vanishes, the headlines screamed. He was dubbed the missingest man in New York. The idea that a powerful Supreme Court judge could simply disappear from a busy Manhattan street was shocking and deeply unsettling. The investigation that followed would become one of the most intense in the city's history. A deep dive into the corrupt and dangerous world of Tammany Hall. Politics. The police were faced with three main theories. The first was that Judge Crater had simply decided to run away. Perhaps he was tired of his life, his marriage, his career. Perhaps he had taken the cash he had withdrawn that day and had started a new life somewhere else with one of his showgirl mistresses. This theory was appealing in its simplicity, but it didn't quite fit the man. Crater was at the peak of his career, a man who loved the spotlight and the power that came with his position. Why would he throw it all away? And if he had run away, how had he managed to remain completely hidden for so long, without ever being recognized? The second theory was that he was a victim of foul play, murdered by the criminal underworld. As a judge, he had likely made enemies. But the investigation soon revealed a more specific and dangerous possibility. At the time of his disappearance, a major corruption investigation was underway, targeting the very heart of the Tammany Hall political machine. It was rumored that Judge Crater, through his political connections, had knowledge of some of the machine's most sensitive and illegal activities. It was whispered that he might have been about to testify in the corruption probe, or that he was being blackmailed by powerful figures. In this scenario, Judge Crater was not just a missing person. He was a political liability. He had been straightening out those fellows, just as he had told his wife, and those fellows had decided that the only way to straighten him out for good was to make him disappear. He had been murdered by the mob to ensure his silence. This theory seemed to fit the context of the time perfectly. It was a story of a good man who had gotten in too deep with the wrong people and had paid the ultimate price. The third theory was a variation of the second, but with a more personal twist. It suggested that his disappearance was not related to his judicial duties, but to his secret life. Perhaps he had a gambling debt he couldn't pay. Or perhaps his disappearance was the result of a crime of passion, a love triangle with a jealous husband or another lover of one of his showgirls. His complicated private life offered a host of potential motives for someone to want him out of the picture. The investigation became a massive, sprawling effort. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, from high-powered politicians to Broadway chorus girls. They searched for the taxi driver who had picked him up that night, but he was never found. They dredged the city's rivers. They followed up on hundreds of false sightings from all over the country and even the world. 4 years, spotting Judge Crater became a kind of national pastime. But the investigation was also hampered by the very corruption it was trying to navigate. Witnesses were intimidated. Key figures refused to talk. The code of silence of the underworld was absolute. The police were trying to solve a mystery in a city where secrets were a form of currency. One of the most intriguing and mysterious parts of the case was the portfolio of documents that Crater had taken from his office that day. After he disappeared, his wife Stella returned to their apartment. She found the cash he had withdrawn stuffed in a dresser drawer, but the portfolio was gone. And inside one of the empty envelopes, she found a cryptic note written by her husband. It simply said, "I am very weary. Love, Joe." What was in that portfolio? Were they the documents that held the key to the Tammany Hall corruption? Were they blackmail material? Or were they simply personal papers? The contents of that portfolio, like the judge himself, vanished without a trace. The case of Judge Crater became more than just a missing persons case. It became a symbol of the deep and pervasive corruption of the era. His empty seat on the bench was a constant public reminder of a man who had been swallowed by the system he was supposed to represent. The grand jury investigation into his disappearance would continue for years, but it would never lead to an indictment. No one was ever charged in connection with his vanishing. He was eventually declared legally dead in 1939. The story of Judge Crater is a perfect storm of a mystery. It has a charismatic and complex central figure, a backdrop of political corruption and high-stakes intrigue, a cast of colorful characters from showgirls to mobsters, and a complete and total lack of physical evidence. It is a story where the truth was likely buried under layers of power, influence, and fear. The question was not just where Judge Crater had gone, but who had the power to make a man disappear so completely, and why. The city had its secrets, and it seemed determined to keep them. The missingest man in New York remained missing, his fate a permanent, haunting question mark hanging over the city's glittering, corrupt skyline. In the years and decades following Judge Crater's vanishing, the case became a cornerstone of American folklore, a real-life noir mystery that refused to fade. His name became a common phrase, to pull a crater, meaning to disappear completely. The investigation, while officially open for decades, produced a steady stream of tantalizing but ultimately unverifiable clues, each one adding another layer of myth to the already legendary case. Stella Crater, the judge's wife, never gave up the search for her husband, or at least for the truth of what happened to him. She became a widow in limbo, unable to move on, forever tied to the mystery. For years, she held onto the belief that he was alive, that he had run off with another woman and would one day return. But as time went on, she became convinced that he had been a victim of foul play, murdered by the corrupt political machine he had become entangled with. She lived a long and quiet life, passing away in 1969, nearly 40 years after her husband walked out of that restaurant, still without any definitive answers. The Tammany Hall corruption scandal, which many believed was at the heart of Crater's disappearance, did eventually explode. The investigation, known as the Seabury Commission, exposed a vast network of bribery and graft that reached the highest levels of New York City government, leading to the resignation of Mayor Jimmy Walker. Many of the powerful figures that Crater had known, the fellows he was going to straighten out, were disgraced. It is widely believed that Crater had direct knowledge of their crimes and that his potential testimony would have been devastating. This theory remains the most powerful and widely accepted explanation for his disappearance. He was a witness who was permanently silenced before he could talk. But who did the silencing? The list of potential culprits within the Tammany Hall orbit is long. One prominent theory focuses on a shadowy political fixer who was a known associate of both Crater and the city's mob bosses. This man would have had the motive to protect the political machine and the means, the connections to the criminal underworld, to orchestrate a clean and professional disappearance. In this scenario, Crater was likely lured into a car, murdered, and his body disposed of in a way that would ensure it would never be found, perhaps buried in the foundation of a new construction project, a common method for the mob at the time. Another, more specific theory came to light decades later in 2005. A woman named Stella Ferrucci Good, who was 91 years old at the time, came forward with a deathbed confession she had heard from her late husband. She claimed her husband had told her that a police officer and his brother, a taxi driver, had murdered Judge Crater and had buried his body under the Coney Island boardwalk. According to this story, the officer was connected to the mob and was acting on their orders. The police investigated this lead, even using ground-penetrating radar to search the area under the boardwalk, but they found nothing. The story, like so many others, was a compelling piece of anecdotal evidence, but it could not be proven. The mystery of the two women who were with Crater on his final night also lingered. Sally Lou Ritz, his showgirl mistress, was questioned extensively. She maintained that she knew nothing about his plans or his disappearance. She eventually faded from the public eye, her brief moment in the spotlight of a national scandal coming to an end. The other woman, the lawyer William Klein's friend, also offered no useful information. They were simply the last people to see him, the witnesses to the moment a man stepped out of his life and into legend. The case of Judge Crater is a powerful illustration of a particular kind of crime, one that is possible only in a world of deep systemic corruption. It is a story about how power can be used not just to commit a crime, but to erase it. The silence that surrounded Crater's disappearance was not a natural one. It was a manufactured one, a silence enforced by fear and political influence. The witnesses who knew something were too afraid to talk. The officials who might have had suspicions were too compromised to act. The truth was not just hidden. It was actively suppressed. The cultural impact of the case was immense. It became a symbol of a bygone era, a shorthand for the high-stakes world of New York in the age of speakeasies and political bosses. The story has been referenced in countless books, films, and television shows. He is the ghost in the machine of New York history, a man who represents the dark side of the city's glittering ambition. What makes the Crater case so enduring is its perfect, almost literary structure. It has a hero with a fatal flaw, a secret life that makes him vulnerable. It has a cast of powerful villains, the shadowy figures of Tammany Hall. It has a damsel in distress, his loyal wife Stella, searching for the truth. And it has the ultimate MacGuffin, the missing portfolio, the container of secrets that holds the key to the entire mystery. But unlike a work of fiction, this story has no final chapter. We are left to wonder forever about the contents of that portfolio. What secrets did Judge Crater take with him from his office that day? Were they documents proving the corruption of the city's most powerful men? Were they love letters from his mistress? Or were they simply legal papers of no consequence at all? The answer to that question likely holds the answer to his fate. The search for Judge Crater's body has never officially ended. Even today, when construction crews dig into the foundations of old New York buildings, there is a small, whispered thought in the back of some people's minds. Will they find the judge? He has become the city's most famous lost soul. His bones rumored to be part of the very concrete and steel that make up the modern metropolis. In the end, we are left with a story that is as much about a time and a place as it is about a man. It is a story about the New York of the 1930s, a city of immense energy, creativity, and corruption, a city that was capable of creating a man like Judge Crater, and just as capable of swallowing him whole. The mystery of his disappearance is not one that can be solved with DNA or modern forensics. The trail is not just cold. It is buried under nearly a century of history, under layers of concrete, and under a mountain of lies and silence. The truth of what happened on that August night in 1930 is known only to the men who were in that taxi, the men who orchestrated the vanishing. And they, like the judge himself, are long gone. All that remains is the legend of the missingest man in New York, a story that serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most effective way to keep a secret is not to hide it, but to erase the person who knows it. Judge Joseph Force Crater didn't just disappear. He was deleted from the world, a man of power and prominence who learned too late that in the city of secrets, some secrets are so dangerous that they demand a human price. His empty chair on the bench of the New York State Supreme Court became a permanent monument to a man, a city, and a truth that were lost forever. The disappearance of the Beaumont children, the vanishing of Judge Crater, was a story of adult corruption. A man erased by a world of power and secrets he knew too much about. But there is another kind of disappearance, one that is far more fundamental in its terror. It is the loss of children, a crime that strikes not at the corridors of power, but at the heart of a family and the soul of a nation. For our next story, we travel across the globe to the sun-drenched shores of Australia in the mid-1960s. This was a time of perceived innocence and safety, an era of booming prosperity and a carefree beach culture. It is here, on a hot public holiday, that three young siblings would take a short bus ride to the beach for a day of fun, and then simply evaporate into thin air. This is not a story with a complex web of clues, but one defined by a profound and terrifying void. It's a case that would forever change the way a country saw itself. This is the story of the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Our story begins on Australia Day, January 26, 1966. The city of Adelaide was shimmering in the midst of a summer heatwave. The air was thick and still, and the only sensible place to be was the beach. Glenelg Beach, a popular seaside suburb, was a vibrant tableau of Australian life. The sand was a kaleidoscope of colorful towels and umbrellas. The water was filled with splashing swimmers, and the air hummed with the sound of laughter and transistor radios playing the latest hits. It was, by all accounts, a perfect summer day. At their modest home in the nearby suburb of Somerton Park, the three Beaumont children were getting ready for an adventure. There was Jane, the oldest at 9, a responsible and naturally maternal big sister. There was Arna, 7, a mischievous and spirited middle child. And there was Grant, the youngest at 4, a happy, curious little boy. They were, by all accounts, good kids from a stable and loving home. Their parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, were hardworking people. Jim was a taxi driver, Nancy a homemaker, who had built a comfortable, if simple, life for their family. They trusted their children, and more importantly, they trusted their community. In the Australia of 1966, a certain kind of easygoing freedom was a birthright. Children walked to school alone, played in the streets until dusk, and were looked after by a collective, unspoken neighborhood watch. On that morning, Jane, the sensible older sister, asked her parents a simple question. Could she and her siblings take the bus to Glenelg Beach by themselves? It was only a 5-minute bus ride. She had made the trip before and had always been impeccably reliable. Their mother, Nancy, was hesitant. The beach would be swarming with people on a public holiday, and Grant was still so young. But Jane was persuasive. She was a mature 9-year-old, and she promised to keep a close eye on her younger brother and sister. Reluctantly, Nancy agreed. It was a decision that would become the source of a lifetime of unimaginable regret. She gave Jane some money, a few shillings and pence, for the bus fare and for some snacks. She watched her 3 children, dressed in their swimsuits and carrying their beach towels, walk to the bus stop. She told Jane to make sure they were all back on the 12 o'clock bus. Around 10 a.m., the 3 Beaumont children boarded the bus for Glenelg. They waved goodbye to their mother. It was the last time she would ever see them. Noon came, and the 12 o'clock bus arrived at the stop near their home. The Beaumont children were not on it. At first, Nancy wasn't overly concerned. Kids lose track of time, especially when they're having fun at the beach. She assumed they had missed the bus and would be on the next one at 2 p.m. But when the 2 o'clock bus came and went, and then the 3 o'clock bus, and there was still no sign of her children, Nancy's worry began to curdle into a cold, hard knot of fear. She called her husband, Jim, at his work. He immediately left his job and rushed home. Together, they drove the short distance to Glenelg Beach to search for their children themselves. The beach was still a chaotic sea of humanity. They walked up and down the packed sand, their eyes frantically scanning the crowds, calling out the names of Jane, Arna, and Grant. They checked the playgrounds, the amusement arcades, the milk bars along the esplanade. But there was nothing. As the hot afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows on the sand, their panic reached a fever pitch. At 5:30 p.m., they walked into the local police station and reported their 3 children missing. The investigation that followed was one of the largest and most intense in Australian history. The disappearance of 3 young children from a crowded public place on a national holiday was an unprecedented event. It struck at the very heart of the nation's sense of self, its belief in its own safety and innocence. The entire country was captivated and horrified by the story. The smiling, sun-kissed faces of the 3 Beaumont children were plastered on the front page of every newspaper. their images becoming an instant and tragic symbol. The police launched a massive search. They combed every inch of Glenelg Beach and the surrounding sand dunes. They searched parks, creeks, and every vacant building in the area. Hundreds of volunteers from all over Adelaide joined the search, a community united in a desperate, hopeful effort. But they found nothing. Not a single piece of clothing, not a beach towel, not a discarded toy. It was as if the 3 children had simply dissolved into the summer air. The investigation then turned to the painstaking work of trying to piece together the children's last known movements. A number of credible witnesses came forward, people who had seen the children at the beach that day. A local postman who knew the family saw them walking happily towards the beach around 10:15 a.m. Several other witnesses saw them playing on the grass near the Glenelg jetty. Then, a more detailed and deeply disturbing picture began to emerge. Multiple, independent witnesses reported seeing the 3 children in the company of a man. He was described as tall, thin, with sun-bleached blonde hair and a lean, athletic build, somewhere in his mid-30s. He was seen laughing and playing with the children, splashing with them in the shallow water. The witnesses all noted the same thing. The children seemed completely comfortable with him, not at all frightened. They looked as if they knew him, as if he were a family friend or a favorite uncle. At around 11:45 a.m., just 15 minutes before they were due to catch the bus home, a shopkeeper at the local pie store bakery saw Jane Beaumont come into the shop by herself. She bought some meat pies and a fruit pastry, using a £1 note to pay for them. This was a strange and crucial detail. Her mother had only given her loose coins, enough for the bus and some cheap lollies. Where had a 9-year-old girl gotten a £1 note? The most logical and most chilling conclusion was that the man she was with had given it to her. This small transaction was a sign that he was not just playing with them. He was actively gaining their trust, using small gifts to break down their natural caution. The last confirmed sighting of the children came from the same postman who had seen them earlier that morning. At around 3 p.m., a full 3 hours after they were supposed to be home, he saw the 3 children walking alone, away from the beach in the general direction of their house. They were holding hands and, according to him, seemed to be happy and laughing. He didn't think much of it at the time, but later he would be tormented by the fact that he hadn't stopped to ask them if they were okay, or where the adult who was supposed to be with them had gone. This final sighting was deeply puzzling. If they were walking home at 3 p.m., what had happened to them on that short journey? And where was the tall, blonde man? Had he left them to walk home alone, only for them to be intercepted by someone else? Or was he nearby, watching them from a distance, waiting for the right moment to make his final move? The police were now faced with a terrifying narrative. It appeared that a predator, a man who was charming, patient, and highly skilled at gaining children's trust, had systematically befriended the Beaumont children on a crowded beach. He had spent hours with them, playing with them, buying them food, and lulling them into a false sense of security. And then, somehow, he had lured them away. The investigation became a nationwide manhunt. The police sketch of the tall, blonde man was circulated everywhere. The police investigated thousands of tips and leads. They looked into every known person of interest in the country, but the man remained a phantom. He had no name, no clear description, and he had vanished as completely as the children themselves. The case was a void, a mystery built on an absence. The only thing the police knew for sure was that on a perfect summer's day, in the middle of a crowd of thousands, a monster had walked among them, and no one had noticed a thing. The innocence of a nation had been stolen, along with 3 of its children. In the weeks and months following the disappearance, the lives of Jim and Nancy Beaumont were consumed by a grief that had no resolution. They remained in the same house in Somerton Park, a home that was now a quiet, haunted museum of their children's lives. They kept their children's bedrooms untouched, the beds made, the toys on the shelves, as if Jane, Arna, and Grant might walk through the door at any moment. They never changed their phone number. They never moved away. They stayed and they waited. This vigil became the central, heartbreaking narrative of the case. The media would periodically revisit the story, usually on the anniversary of the disappearance, and the image of the stoic, grieving parents, still waiting for news after 10, 20, 30 years, became a powerful symbol of their enduring love and the nation's collective sorrow. Nancy Beaumont, in particular, became a figure of quiet, tragic dignity. She rarely spoke to the press, but her sad, hopeful eyes told a story that needed no words. The police investigation, while officially open, became a cyclical process of reviewing old files and following up on new, often strange, leads. The case took on a life of its own, attracting a steady stream of psychics, amateur detectives, and self-proclaimed confessors. One of the most significant and bizarre chapters in the long search came in November 1966, almost 2 years after the disappearance. A Dutch psychic named Gerard Croizet, who had gained some international fame, was brought to Australia to work on the case. His involvement turned the investigation into a media circus. Croizet claimed to have had a powerful vision. He said he saw the children's bodies buried under a newly constructed concrete floor in a warehouse near their home. He identified a specific building, and his pronouncements were so confident that the public, desperate for a breakthrough, raised a significant amount of money to have the floor of the building excavated. For days, the nation watched as workers with jackhammers broke through the concrete slab, but after digging deep into the earth beneath, they found nothing. The Croizet lead was a complete and utter failure, a cruel and public false dawn that left the Beaumonts and the community even more heartbroken than before. It was a harsh lesson in the difference between desperate hope and credible evidence. The case took another strange turn a few years later when the Beaumonts began to receive a series of taunting, anonymous letters. 2 letters were sent, one supposedly written by Jane, the other by a man who claimed to be holding the children. The letters claimed the children were alive and well, and that the man had appointed himself their guardian. He offered to return the children to their parents at a designated time and place. The police, working with the Beaumonts, set up a sting operation at the meeting spot. They waited, their hopes cautiously high, but the man and the children never appeared. It was later determined by forensic analysis that the letters were an elaborate and cruel hoax, perpetrated by a local teenager who was later identified. The hoax was another devastating blow to the family's fragile hope. As the years turned into decades, the investigation continued to focus on a handful of high-profile suspects, though no definitive link was ever made. One of the most prominent was a man named Bevan Spencer von Einem, who was convicted in the 1980s for the murder of a young man. His crime was part of a horrific series of killings in Adelaide known as the family murders. Von Einem fit the physical description of the man on the beach, and some witnesses from his own trial claimed he had bragged to fellow inmates about abducting and killing the Beaumont children, but he has never confessed, and there is no physical evidence to connect him to their disappearance. Another significant person of interest was Arthur Stanley Brown, a man who was charged with, but never formally convicted of, the murder of 2 other young girls in Queensland. Brown bore a striking resemblance to the police sketch of the Beaumont abductor and was known to have been in the Adelaide area at the time of their disappearance. He died in prison in 2002 before any definitive link could be established. The disappearance of the Beaumont children is a profound and foundational story in the Australian psyche. It is often referred to as the day Australia lost its innocence. Before 1966, Australia saw itself as a safe, friendly, and somewhat naive country, a place where children were free to roam and communities looked out for one another. The idea that a predator could simply pluck 3 children from a crowded public beach in broad daylight was unthinkable. The case changed everything. It ushered in a new era of parental fear and a more cynical view of the world. The story of the Beaumont children became a national cautionary tale, a story told to generations of Australian children to teach them about stranger danger. The freedom that children had once enjoyed was curtailed, replaced by a new culture of supervision and safety. The case did not just destroy one family. It reshaped the childhood of an entire nation. The mystery endures not because of a wealth of strange clues, but because of a profound lack of them. There is no crime scene, no bodies, no physical evidence. There is only a void. The children, the man they were with, the car they may have gotten into. They all simply disappeared from a crowded beach, as if they had stepped through a crack in the world. The most likely scenario, and the one that is accepted by most investigators, is that the children were abducted and murdered on the day they disappeared. The man on the beach was a predator, a skilled and confident manipulator of children. He likely spent time grooming them, gaining their trust with his friendly demeanor and gifts of money and food. He was what is now known as a preferential offender, someone who specifically targets children. He lured them away from the beach to a secluded location, perhaps in his car, and then killed them, disposing of their bodies in a place where they would never be found. This explanation is simple, logical, and terrifying. It doesn't require a grand conspiracy or a supernatural event. It only requires the presence of one single evil individual who was in the right place at the right time. The identity of this man remains the great unanswered question. In 2013, and again in 2018, police excavated sites at a factory that had once been owned by another prominent person of interest, a wealthy businessman who had a history of preying on children. These searches, driven by new witness testimony and forensic analysis, brought the case back into the national spotlight, but both ended in disappointment. No human remains were found. In 2017, the South Australian government offered a $1 million reward for information leading to a resolution of the case, one of the largest rewards in the country's history. But even that has failed to produce any new, credible breakthroughs. Jim Beaumont passed away in 2023, Nancy having passed away in 2019. They died without ever knowing what happened to their children. They spent over 50 years waiting, a vigil that defined their lives and became a symbol of a nation's enduring grief. Their story is a heartbreaking testament to the power of a parent's love and the profound, unending pain of an unresolved loss. Today, Glenelg Beach is still a popular and vibrant place. Families still spread their towels on the sand. Children still splash in the waves. But for those who know the story, a shadow lingers over the bright, sunny landscape. It is impossible to stand on that beach and not think of Jane, Arna, and Grant. It is impossible not to scan the crowd and feel a faint echo of the fear and confusion that descended on that place so long ago. The disappearance of the Beaumont children is more than just a cold case. It is a piece of living history, a national wound that has never fully healed. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the simplest ones. There is no complex puzzle to solve, no secret code to crack. There is only a void and the terrible, silent question that hangs within it. How can 3 children simply vanish from the world? The answer is as simple as it is horrifying, because someone took them. And the fact that we may never know who that someone was is the final, tragic injustice in a story defined by loss. The sun set on that Australia Day in 1966, and for the Beaumont family and for a nation, it has, in some ways, never truly risen again. The disappearance of Frederick Valentik, the mystery of the Beaumont children, was a story grounded in the most terrestrial of fears, the loss of a child from a place of supposed safety. But there is another kind of vanishing, one that takes place not on a crowded beach, but at 10,000 feet, in the vast, empty, and profoundly isolating expanse of the night sky. It's a story not of a crime scene, but of a final, chilling transmission from a man who was seeing something he could not understand, before disappearing so completely that his fate has become one of the most compelling and debated UFO encounters in modern history. For our final story, we travel back to the late 1970s, to the turbulent, windswept skies over southern Australia. This is not a tale of human malice, but of an encounter with the unknown, a mystery that lives in the crackle of a final radio broadcast and the deafening silence that followed. It's a case that has no body, no wreckage, and no answer, only a single haunting question. What was in the sky with Frederick Valentik? Our story begins on the evening of Saturday, October 21st, 1978. Frederick Valentik was a 20-year-old pilot with about 150 hours of flying time. By all accounts, he was a quiet, serious young man, though his family and friends knew him as a bit of a dreamer. He had a passionate and well-documented interest in UFOs, having collected articles and spoken to his family about strange things he believed he had seen in the sky before. This personal interest would become a crucial and controversial lens through which his final moments would be viewed. On this particular evening, Valentik was undertaking a routine training flight. His plan was simple: to fly his single-engine Cessna 182 from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne. across the Bass Strait, to King Island, a small island located about halfway to Tasmania. It was a journey of about 125 miles over open water, a flight he was qualified to make. He was flying to pick up some crayfish for his family, a simple errand that would turn into an enduring global enigma. Valentik took off from Moorabbin at 6:19 p.m. The weather was clear, the visibility was excellent, and the flight began without incident. He was in regular radio contact with Melbourne Air Traffic Control, providing routine updates on his position and altitude. For the first 45 minutes of the flight, everything was perfectly normal. A young pilot on a solo journey across a calm sea as the sun began to set. Then, at 7:06 p.m., as Valentik was flying over the Bass Strait, just off the coast near a landmark called Cape Otway, the tone of his voice on the radio suddenly changed. The calm, professional cadence was gone, replaced by a note of genuine confusion and unease. He keyed his microphone and contacted the air traffic controller in Melbourne, a man named Steve Roby. "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below me?" Valentik asked. Roby, a seasoned professional, checked his radar. "Delta Sierra Juliet, no known traffic in your area," he replied. Valentik then reported that he could see a large aircraft below him, but he couldn't identify it. He said it had 4 bright lights, which he initially described as landing lights. His next transmission was more urgent. He reported that the unknown aircraft had passed over him at high speed, about 1,000 feet above him. This was the beginning of a radio transmission that would last for nearly 7 minutes, a conversation that would be recorded, transcribed, and analyzed for decades to come. A real-time audio document of a man encountering the inexplicable. Valentik continued to describe the strange aircraft. "It seems to be playing some sort of game," he told Roby, his voice now clearly strained. "He's flying over me too, 3 times at a time at speeds I could not identify." Roby, trying to make sense of the situation, maintained his calm, professional demeanor, repeatedly assuring Valentik that there was absolutely no other aircraft visible on his radar. The sky around the young pilot should have been empty. Valentik's description of the object grew more and more bizarre. "It's a long shape," he said, struggling to find the words. "Cannot identify any more than that. It has a green light and sort of metallic-like. It's all shiny on the outside." He reported that the object was now orbiting above him, its movements unlike any conventional aircraft he knew. His breathing was becoming more audible over the radio, his words more rushed. Then, the encounter seemed to escalate from a strange sighting to a direct, physical interaction. Valentik reported that his own aircraft was now experiencing engine trouble. "My engine is rough idling," he said, his voice laced with a new, sharp urgency. "It's got a rough idle. I've got it set at 23, 24, and the thing is coughing." It appeared that the presence of the strange object was having a physical effect on his plane. Roby, trying to get a handle on the situation, asked him again to identify the aircraft. Valentik's reply was a stunning one, a moment that has become the crux of the entire mystery. "I cannot," he said. It's not an aircraft." With that statement, Valentik had crossed a threshold. An experienced pilot, looking at something in the sky with his own eyes, was now certain that what he was seeing was not a man-made plane. The final moments of the transmission are a descent into pure, high strangeness. Valentik reported that the object was now hovering directly above him. He said, with a sense of awe and fear in his voice, "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." And then, in his last recorded words, he keyed the microphone. But what came through was not a word. For 17 seconds, a strange, harsh, metallic, scraping sound was broadcast over the radio. It was a rhythmic, grinding noise, described by some as sounding like metal on metal. And then, there was only silence. Frederick Valentik and his Cessna 182 had vanished from the sky. Immediately after the radio transmission cut out, a massive air and sea search was launched. For 4 days, Royal Australian Air Force planes, Coast Guard vessels, and civilian volunteers scoured the waters of the Bass Strait. They searched 1,000 square miles of ocean, a vast and empty expanse, hoping to find any trace of the missing plane. An oil slick, a piece of floating wreckage, a life raft. They found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of the Cessna, not a drop of oil. It was as if the plane and its pilot had been completely and utterly plucked from the sky, leaving no trace of their existence behind. The search was eventually called off, and Frederick Valentik was declared missing, presumed dead. The official investigation, conducted by the Australian Department of Transport, was unable to come to any definitive conclusion. They reviewed the chilling radio transcripts, they interviewed the air traffic controller Steve Roby, and they considered every possible rational explanation. But the case was a complete anomaly. The final report stated that the reason for the disappearance could not be determined. They concluded that it was presumed fatal for Valentik. The official file was left open, a bureaucratic monument to an unsolvable mystery. In the absence of any official explanation, a host of theories emerged, each one attempting to make sense of Valentik's final, terrifying minutes. These theories, much like in the Dyatlov Pass case, fall into two broad categories: the rational and the extraordinary. The rational explanations attempt to find a logical, earth-based cause for the disappearance. One of the most prominent of these theories is that Valentik became the victim of spatial disorientation. This is a well-known phenomenon in aviation, where a pilot, especially at night over a featureless expanse of water, can lose their sense of which way is up, becoming trapped in a graveyard spiral without even realizing it. In this scenario, Valentik would have been flying in circles, his plane banking, and what he perceived as another aircraft with bright lights was simply the reflection of his own Cessna's lights off the calm surface of the sea. The metallic scraping sound at the end of the transmission would have been the sound of his plane hitting the water at high speed. This theory is plausible and is favored by many skeptics. It accounts for his confusion and the lack of any other radar contact. However, it doesn't fit all the facts perfectly. Valentik was not a complete novice. He was trained for night flying over water, and his detailed description of the object, that it was long, had a green light, and was orbiting him at high speed, is difficult to reconcile with a simple reflection. Furthermore, the air traffic controller, Steve Roby, has always maintained that Valentik sounded rational and coherent throughout the exchange, not like a man who was disoriented and in a state of panic, at least until the very end. Another rational theory is that Valentik, for reasons unknown, decided to stage his own disappearance. In this scenario, the entire UFO story was a pre-planned deception to cover his escape. He would have faked the radio conversation, then flown his plane to a low altitude, bailed out, and let the plane crash into the sea, while he swam to a prearranged boat or a remote stretch of coast. This theory is intriguing, but it lacks any evidence. There was nothing in Valentik's background to suggest he was in any kind of trouble or had any reason to want to start a new life. He was a quiet young man who lived with his parents and was close to his family. It seems a wildly out-of-character act. Then, there are the more extraordinary explanations, the ones that take Frederick Valentik at his word. This is the theory that he did, in fact, have a genuine and fatal encounter with an unidentified flying object. Proponents of this theory point to a number of supporting details. Valentik's known interest in UFOs is seen not as a sign of a suggestible mind, but as the reason he was able to accurately identify what he was seeing as something unconventional. His description of the object, a fast-moving, metallic craft with bright lights, is consistent with thousands of other UFO reports from around the world. And most importantly, there is the matter of corroborating evidence. In the weeks and even hours surrounding Valentik's disappearance, there was a significant wave of UFO sightings reported all along the coast of the Bass Strait. Multiple independent witnesses on the ground reported seeing a strange, fast-moving green light in the sky on the very night that Valentik vanished. One plumber named Roy Manifold, an amateur photographer, even took a series of photographs of the sunset over the water that evening near Cape Otway. When he developed the film, he found a strange, dark object in the corner of one of the frames, seemingly moving at incredible speed out of the water. The authenticity of this photograph has been debated for years, but for many, it is a tantalizing piece of evidence that suggests Valentik was not hallucinating. that there really was something strange in the sky with him that night. The mystery had just begun, and the silence from the sky was deafening. The rational explanations, while plausible to a degree, have always felt incomplete to those who have studied the case in depth. They require a series of coincidences and assumptions that stretch the bounds of probability. To believe the disorientation theory, one must accept that an experienced pilot, flying in clear weather, became so profoundly confused that he mistook his own reflection for an intelligently controlled, orbiting craft, and that this psychological event happened to coincide with a genuine mechanical failure in his engine. It asks us to dismiss not only his own words, but also the corroborating testimony of witnesses on the ground. This is where the more extraordinary theories take hold, not because they are more believable in a conventional sense, but because they seem to better fit the strange and specific details of the event. If we take Valentik at his word, then he was a man in a small, vulnerable aircraft who found himself in the presence of a technology that was far beyond his comprehension. The theory that he encountered a secret, experimental military craft is a compelling middle ground. The Bay Strait is a strategically important waterway, and the nearby Woomera prohibited area was a known site for advanced aerospace and weapons testing. Could Valentik have accidentally stumbled upon a black project, a top-secret, unmanned drone, or a new type of hypersonic aircraft being tested? This would explain the object's high speed, its unconventional appearance, and its ability to hover. It would also explain the government's official silence and its inability to provide a clear explanation. In this scenario, the encounter could have been an accident. The experimental craft's powerful engine or electronic systems might have interfered with the Cessna's engine, causing it to fail. Or, more sinisterly, the encounter could have been deliberate. If Valentik had gotten too close to a top-secret project, he might have been seen as a security risk, a witness who needed to be silenced. His disappearance would then have been a quiet, clean-up operation, his plane and his body disposed of to protect a national secret. This theory is a favorite among those who are skeptical of extraterrestrial explanations but are equally unconvinced by the pilot error theory. It has all the intrigue of a spy thriller, but like all the other theories, it remains pure speculation, with no declassified documents or whistleblowers ever coming forward to support it. This leaves us with the final and most famous explanation, that Frederick Valentik had a genuine and fatal close encounter with an extraterrestrial craft. For proponents of this theory, the Valentik case is one of the crown jewels of ufology. It is a case with a credible witness, a pilot, a real-time audio recording of the event, corroborating ground witnesses, and potential photographic evidence. In this narrative, Valentik was not disoriented. He was a terrified but accurate reporter of a phenomenal event. The object he encountered was real, intelligently controlled, and not of this world. What was its intention? Was it simply curious, its presence inadvertently causing his plane to fail? Or was its purpose more direct and more terrifying? The abduction theory is the most fantastic, and for many, the most compelling version of this narrative. The strange metallic scraping sound heard in the final 17 seconds of his transmission is interpreted as the sound of his Cessna being drawn into or making contact with a larger mother ship. In this view, Frederick Valentik and his entire aircraft were not destroyed. They were taken. He was not a victim of a crash, but of an abduction, plucked from the sky for reasons we can only guess at. This theory transforms the story from a simple mystery into a modern myth, a tale of a human being who crossed the ultimate frontier. The legacy of the Frederick Valentik case is a profound and lasting one. It is a story that has been analyzed and debated for over 40 years, a perfect Rorschach test for one's own beliefs about the world and the universe. Skeptics see a clear case of pilot error and psychological delusion. Believers see irrefutable proof of an extraterrestrial presence. And those in the middle see a deeply strange and unsettling mystery that defies all easy categorization. The case had a significant impact on his family. His father, Guido Valentik, spent the rest of his life searching for answers. Convinced that his son had been taken by a UFO, he became a dedicated researcher, collecting witness statements and pushing the government for more information, never giving up hope that the truth would one day be revealed. The recording of Valentik's final transmission remains one of the most chilling pieces of audio in the history of aviation mysteries. To listen to it is to be a direct witness to a man's final moments as he confronts the unknown. You can hear the evolution of his emotional state, from professional curiosity, to confusion, to awe, and finally, to a dawning, palpable fear. It is the sound of a rational mind being pushed to its absolute limit, the sound of a man trying to describe the impossible. The case is a perfect storm of evidence and ambiguity. It has just enough credible, documented information to make it impossible to dismiss, but not enough to ever be definitively solved. The mystery endures because every piece of the puzzle can be viewed from at least two different angles. The lights in the sky were either a UFO or a reflection. The engine failure was either caused by an external force or a simple mechanical issue. The final, strange sound was either the sound of a crash or the sound of an abduction. We are left where the investigation began, with a young pilot, a small plane, and an empty sky. The fate of Frederick Valentik is a question that will likely never be answered. Did his journey end in the cold, dark waters of the Bass Strait, a tragic victim of a simple mistake? Or did his journey continue, taking him to a place beyond our comprehension, a final, unknown destination among the stars? The silence that followed his final, metallic cry is a void that has been filled with 4 decades of speculation, fear, and wonder. His story has become a modern legend, a campfire tale for the technological age. He is the pilot who flew too close to a truth he wasn't meant to see, the man who radioed a message from the edge of reality and then disappeared forever. His case remains a profound and unsettling reminder that the world is still full of mysteries, that there are still things in the sky and in the sea that we do not understand, and that sometimes a person can simply fly off the edge of the map, leaving behind nothing but a single, haunting question, broadcast over a crackling radio. A question that still echoes in the vast, empty silence of the Australian sky.